The 13th century saw the flourishing of two of the greatest systems of thought in the history of the Western theological world. Paris would give us the flowering of dialectical theology in the form of scholasticism, and Castile would give birth to the theosophical speculations that became the Kabbalah. But this crucible that would produce the Kabbalah was anything other than simple. A range of ideas fermented and surged, and what history reveals is that not one Kabbalah, but several distinct schools briefly flourished before being subsumed into that titanic mythical system of the Sefirot developed in the Sefer Zohar, the Book of Radiance. One of these primordial schools of Kabbalah developed a rival system of intra-divine and cosmological emanations, ultimately resulting in not 10, but 13 spherote. In the tradition of the Sefer Ha-Iyyun, the Book of Contemplation, we find a great bridge, a transitional form between the terrifying world of Merkava mysticism and the mystical theosophy of the Kabbalah. But what did this extinct form of Kabbalah teach? Let's explore this amazing and interesting Kabbalah of contemplation. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for explorations and topics of esoteric history, and if you'd like to support this kind of work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this episode, I'd hope you check out my Patreon or consider some of the cool merch that we have here on the channel. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get a reliable lay of the land, I'd really recommend that you check out my study guide on the study of Western esotericism. And if you're interested in actual historical books on topics of the occult and the mystical, I'd hope you check out Esoterica Rare Books, where you can pick up a 16th century volume of magic or the occult. You can find all of those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's turn to the now lost Kabbalah of contemplation and its strange system of 13 Sefirot. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. As I mentioned in the introduction, the 13th century was one of the most important in the history of the development of Western philosophy and spirituality. And while this trend is pretty widely recognized, especially in the Christian world, I mean, this century would see the birth and flourishing of the greatest of Christian, at least Western Latin Christian minds, second probably only to Augustine, including that great pinnacle that was medieval philosophy in Thomas Aquinas, but also Albertus Magnus and much else besides. This century would also see a similar explosion just across the border in Spain in Jewish esoteric theosophical and theological speculation, ultimately resulting in the Kabbalah. In fact, several factors conspired to produce a system of mystical theosophy that we now know as Kabbalah, which has become basically the de facto theology of Judaism ever since. Those factors would include things like the still burning ember that was the Maimonides controversy, the dissemination of earlier magical and mystical text, especially the very dramatic text of the Merkava mysticism by the Pietists of Germany, a renewed interest or continued interest in primordial cosmology inspired by the extremely brief and positively enigmatic Sefer Yetzirah, a rising messianic fervor inspired by both the coming of the 6th millennium in the Jewish calendar and some of the pogroms that were taking place in those areas. There tends to be an uptick in messianism when there are active pogroms, which all in turn inspired a widening dissemination of previously esoteric speculations, which had been pretty rigorously kept secret up to that point. These factors would see the 13th century becoming the crucible for the production of the Kabbalah as we all know and love it. But that process was anything other than linear. In fact, various distinct schools, what we might call proto-Kabbalah, would emerge with their own unique form of mystical speculation. And it's to one of those proto-schools of esoteric speculation that I want to turn to now in the Sefer Ha-Iyyun, the Book of Contemplation. This distinct school of thought is represented by two texts, the aforementioned Sefer Ha-Iyyun, the Book of Contemplation, and the Ma'ayan HaChochmah, or the Fountain of Wisdom. In this episode, I want to concentrate specifically on the Sefer Ha-Iyyun. As we're going to see, it's complicated enough, and I want to come back to the Fountain of Wisdom in a later episode. It's somehow even more complicated. But the Book of Contemplation is a relatively brief, densely and frankly obscurely composed speculative text which details how an utterly transcendent and unknowable, really unthinkable divinity emerges as a divine, how the divine generates itself, and then goes on to generate the divine realm in which the god will dwell before eventually generating the celestial realm and the terrestrial realm. The text itself survives in several recensions, an older, short recension, which is probably the Ur text, a longer and more detailed version, a text that became the standard witness that strangely details not 10, but 13 spherote. Now, this is a bit strange because there are usually only 10, as you probably know from the Sefer Yetzirah and basically all other forms of Kabbalah, but also because the oldest version of the text actually details a rival system to the entire system of Sefirot that became the Kabbalah as we know it. But one thing at a time. But even the title of the book is interesting. Iyyun, or contemplation, isn't actually a word to be found in the standard dictionary of the Hebrew Bible. It emerged relatively late and by the 13th century had taken on the sense of contemplation, but in a specifically philosophical sense. Thus, we can think of the Sefer Ha-Iyyun as having a very properly theosophical bent, combining at some level mystical speculation and revelation to that degree with also some degree of philosophical method. That is to say, it's some degree of revelation, some degree of mysticism, and some degree of philosophy, thus making it truly theosophical. But let's start with the short recension, as one, it probably represents the original thought of the school that produced it, but also it all contains some of the more dramatic and thus later repressed theosophical elements that I find most interesting about the book. But it opens by telling us that it was composed by a certain Rabbi Shammai. This is an Aramaic word for visionary, literally rabbi visionary, and this character was legendarily associated as a Gaon, or leader of one of the Babylonian academies that produced the Talmud, himself now in this text known as the lead spokesman for what was probably only esoteric and thus secret teachings. But with this introduction, we are positively off to the races. Here we dive directly into the secrets of the Penimiyut, the innermost dimension of the divine glory, or kavod, which is utterly inaccessible to the human mind. Thus, the text must be revealed at some level. The Penimiyut, or innermost, of the divine glory actually initially exists, as much as any predicate obtains of it, in a purely undifferentiated unity. It simply is what can be in such a way that there isn't enough internal distinction to mark out what is knowable, what is known, or what is doing the knowing within this moment of the divine. The text actually denotes this condition as the Achdut HaShaveh, the balanced unity. This is a unity prior to subject and object as the Seter Elyon, or the highest hiddenness. But this absolute unity is active and denoted as, in Hebrew, Aleph Mem Nun, a word that can be read as truly, like Amen, but also as Omen, nurturer, and Uman, artisan, depending on the vocalization of the Hebrew text. And I suspect that the writer wanted to maintain just that polyvalence, but also in this role as the active creator, we have a kind of artisan, or, you guessed it, an uman can be translated from Hebrew as demiurge, thus giving the text a kind of Gnostic-y flavor. This unity as artisan will eventually emanate a series of entities that the texts refer to as kochot, or powers, rather than what we might expect from a text of Kabbalah. We have kochot rather than Sefirot. Thus, this earliest form of the contemplation school focuses on emanations as kochot, powers, rather than spherot. though, as we're going to see, later editions of the text will attempt to accommodate itself to the Sephirotic system as it was developed in the Sefer Bahir and ultimately in the Sefer Zohar. But prior to the Chochot proper, it seems that this pure state of divine unity, now denoted as the Koach Kiyum, the sustaining power, emanates something the text refers to as the Av HaMunah, or the Father of Faith. Now, emunah as faith has a very different philosophical sense in Jewish philosophy, and actually underwent a pretty dramatic transformation itself as a concept in the 13th century. Rather than being the pistis, or trust in the divine, or faith in the sense of human belief in things, emunah is both reliance on the divine, but specifically reliance on the wisdom of the will of the divine. Thus, the Av Emunah, or the Father of Faith, here denotes the active willing of the divine, but also that willing being informed precisely by the infinite wisdom of the divine, thus now denoting the separation in the divine unity between the knower and the known. And unsurprisingly, the text tells us simultaneously with this emanation came about the HaChochma HaKadumah, or the primordial wisdom. Thus we have the Father of Faith instantaneously being emanated with primordial wisdom. And yet, despite this internal intra-divine mitosis, if you will, the unity of the divine being is maintained. As the text tells us, this is like a scent being passed from a scent, or a candle flame lighting another candle flame, like a flame of a fire that is unified with its colors. Thus, these moments within the divine, the utterly unknowable divinity beyond all being, generates itself as being, as knower and known in the Father of Faith and in primordial wisdom. And from this vibrating, pulsing radiance, the kochot, the powers, began to emanate outwards, each flowing from the one ontologically prior to it, but not temporally to it. That is to say, time hasn't yet to exist, but there is a kind of marching emergence or metaphysical hierarchy in the system, but again, not a temporal one. Time itself is somehow yet to come. It's going to be quite a bit later down here in our realm. But the first of these kochot to emerge is Or Mufla, the marvelous light, the kavod, or the glory of the divine as it is visible to the human mind and soul. This is the glory that the mystics behold at that height of ecstasy. From the Or Mufla comes the mysterious Kashmal, denoted as the first of the exalted beings, perhaps something like an angel, that is being now distinct from the divine being itself. Thus, the innermost, the Father of Faith, the primordial wisdom, and the marvelous light are all still somehow moments or aspects of the divine mitosis, the divine unfolding. However, the marvelous light itself is a bit of a liminal event, as it is now being associated with an unnamed angelic being in the text. Well, unnamed in the short recension, but in some of the latter recensions, it's actually called Arafel, and in better texts, it's actually referred to as Anaphiel. Anaphiel. Now, for folks who've studied some Merkava mysticism, I know your ears just perked up, your spidey sense went off. In the Hechelot literature, which I did a whole 15-part seminar last year, you can check out that truly wild ride if you want to, because you would know that Anaphiel in that tradition is the final angel that one encounters before entering the divine throne room, and that makes all the more sense because what flows from that very divine throne? Yep, the next emanation, as we mentioned, Kashmal. But, of course, the Kashmal is one of the most mysterious terms in Jewish lore. It only appears as a kind of strange radiance pouring out of the divine throne in those psychedelically wonderful visions of Ezekiel. Translated into Greek as electrum or amber, its association with the electric spark produced by rubbing amber with wool would give rise to it becoming the modern Hebrew word for electricity. Chashmal in modern Hebrew is electricity. But its primordial meaning probably had something to do with a otherwise unknown gleaming gemstone. There's a probable cognate in Akkadian. However, in the rabbinical imagination, it became a kind of all-consuming divine fire, considered so dangerous that even thinking about it, even contemplating it, could cause one to become utterly consumed and incinerated by it, as was the fate of a young child who thought about the word Kashmal and was immediately immolated. This worried the rabbis so much that these passages mentioning the Kashmal were greatly limited as to who could even study them. Now, if you've ever seen the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, that weird cloud-like fire that melts all the baddies, that's probably what Kashmal was conceived as, face-melting divine fire. And unsurprisingly, it appears whenever the Israelite divinity appears in the form of strange luminous fire. Like that burning bush or the pillar of fire that led the Israelites, that also might have been Kashmal. Further, we learn that the Kashmal is associated with a specific angel, Michael, literally the one like God, or variously, or Paniel, the light of God's face, and corresponds to the first letter of the divine name, the Yod of Yod-He-Vav-He, which in turn has 10 further powers somehow nested inside of it, although we only learn of 2 in the text, image and greatness. Now, what those 10 other powers are isn't clear, but again, mysteries abound in this early literature. Following the emanation of Kashmal, a yet even more mysterious emanation appears, the Arafel. Now, this word means something like gloom, or fog, or mist, or darkness. It's in the clouds of darkness that descended upon Mount Sinai during the Theophany, and it's the foggy gloom that hides the divine fire. Who knew that the Israelite God was a goth? Further, within the Ayin of Arafel, we find 70 names of the divine and various other mysteries revealed through gematria, or numerical manipulation of the letters of Arafel, including the 42-letter divine name. Arafel is also the angel Gabriel, or Tagriel, and contains 5 divine powers nested within itself: holiness, purity, justice, mercy, and judgment. And from the deep gloom of Arafel flows the next emanation, Kisei HaNoga, or the throne of light, of which we learn basically nothing, but it must have been the Vav of the divine name. And then follows from another emanation the Ofangadula, or the wheel of greatness, which is also the looking glass through which prophecy is accomplished and is the final He of the divine name, Yod-He-Vav-He. And these 4 emanations, Kashmal, Arafel, the throne of light, and the wheel of greatness, form the Yesodot, or the foundationals, or the inner holy place, and are bound to the divine like a body is bound with the soul. Again, are these divine? Are these elements within the divine pleroma? It's not exactly clear. Following these emanations, a singular keruv, or cherub, is generated, which seems to stand in the center of all the other emanations and revolves in a kind of radiant brilliance. Following the cherub, the Galgalei HaMerkava, or the wheels of the divine chariot, are emanated, again connecting this literature back to the older Merkava Hechelot tradition. But here in this text, we actually learn that the chariot wheels of the divine throne are actually what catalyze or initiate and drive the movements of the heavens above us. And unsurprisingly, we find the next emanation is the Avir HaSorev, or the encompassing ether, is emanated from the wheels of the chariot, followed by a celestial curtain, the famed celestial curtain, or the Pargod, probably the realm of the fixed stars, which finally separates the divine world from the celestial one. The Pargod, or curtain, has a manhig, or manager, over it, which opens and closes it, eventually allowing transit from the celestial world to the divine world, and presumably from the terrestrial world to the celestial world and up to the divine world. This manhig may be Metatron, who is actually mentioned next at the Guardian of the Realms at the end of the Supernal Realm and at the beginning of the lower worlds, which I love the idea of Metatron just being like the manager, like paging Metatron, someone threw up in aisle 8. At any rate, with this, the text comes to a pretty mysterious end. For the wise, a hint, indicating something about the power of Metatron is sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, but what exactly might this mean? It's possible the text is pointing back to a very old tradition where Metatron is actually known as Yahweh Katan, the lesser Yahweh, and is thus the visible operative power of the divine in the lower world, in our world. Thus, when we encounter the divine in our world, we're actually only encountering the divine via Metatron, or via the divine glory as encompassed by Metatron as a kind of avatar or something. But again, we're left with just a hint, and beyond that, admittedly, it's just me speculating. But I'm still sticking with my idea that Metatron is just like the district manager, or just maybe the store manager. But as the text stands, it's rather extraordinary because it details both the theogenic and cosmogenic processes by which the divine itself comes into existence, but also how the divine realm comes to be populated, and presumably with the Genesis creation story following quickly on the tails of this rather esoteric text. This is basically everything that happens before that beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim. There in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. This is the prequel. And while this text is curious, it does straddle the Merkava mysticism, as I noted, but also the traditions by which the Olam, or universe, was created by the Asara Ma'amorot, or the 10 utterances in the rabbinical tradition. Further, previous systems of philosophical, theosophical, and cosmological speculation also sought to enumerate the development of the divine and cosmic realms into a sequence of 10, perhaps betraying very early ancient Pythagorean influence. Indeed, that's very likely of Sefer Yetzirah, or the Book of Formation, where the neologism spherote, or numerations, first appears. Yeah, the word probably means something like numerations initially. It's Pythagorean. In that text, the Sefirot aren't yet divine emanations, but numericalities through which creation is formed. And it wasn't until the Sefer Bahir, centuries later, 6 centuries later perhaps, that these numerical Sefirot became divine emanations as we know them. But note that in the Book of Contemplation, only the first few emanations are actually part of the ongoing internal differentiation and manifestation of the divine as such. The rest of the entities of that text seem to be those that populate the divine realm, or the pleroma as you might have it more generally. Thus, they're not rightly denoted as Sefirot in the Sefer Bahir, or as in the later Sefer Zohar, but as powers, or chochot. But it's precisely those inner emergent moments of the divine that the longer recensions of the text will eventually seek to self-censor. In the more developed later recensions, the initial inner moments of the divine mitosis, as I've called it, are collapsed. The innermost, the father of faith, and primordial wisdom are all sort of ontologically combined, ontologically flattened out into one entity, where the process of divine emanations now proceeding through the process of mimiut, or diminution, whereby the infinite state of undifferentiation is constricted to allow space, as it were, as much as any of this is spatial or temporal, for beings to come to be. Now, for those of you out there who already know some Kabbalah, this is going to perk your ears up because it sounds a lot like Tzimtzum, and in fact, it seems to be one of the earliest statements of the process of Tzimtzum, or divine contraction, that would be developed by Isaac Luria some 5 centuries later. Yeah, we're still 5 centuries out from Lurianic Kabbalah at this point, folks. But in this recension, the 10 entities from the marvelous light to the celestial curtain are they being emanated to fill this heavenly poroma are actually now being denoted as Sefirot, though initially introduced as mysterious letter pairings, showing that the metaphysics of the text is now being brought into the orbit and influence of the rising Kabbalistic system inaugurated by the Sefer Bahir and brought to flourish by the Zohar. However, the fit is a bit forced. For instance, in this text, the highest of the Sefirot is Kashmal, itself below the marvelous light, which isn't denoted as a Sefirah. So it isn't clear what the 10th of the Sefirot would be, given that the count would exhaust itself at the number 9, at the Pargod, or the heavenly curtain. So it seems to me that the first between the emanations of the Sefer Ha-Iyyun and the Sefirot are just being poorly tacked together at this point for reasons that aren't quite clear to us. However, the text would undergo a final edition, producing the standard recension surviving in about 18 manuscripts, which is not nothing considering this is a very old text, which has now been integrated in with the early Iyyun material and Merkava mythology, and even some pretty clearly magical material. There's a special ring denoted in this literature with a divine name, Araraita, which itself would go on actually to serve as amulets and even ended up in the Erev Rosh Hashanah liturgy, so that's a whole thing. You never really know what's going to survive into mainstream Judaism, but sure enough, here we have some of the Iyyun material. But at the center of the text is perhaps what makes it the most well known. Rather than enumerating 10 spherote, the standard version of the text now counts 13, starting with the primordial wisdom, then the marvelous light, Kashmal, Arafel, the throne of light, the wheel of greatness, the cherub, just the one. 8 is the wheels of the chariot. The encompassing ether follows next, followed by the pargod, or the celestial curtain. The 11th is the throne of glory. The 12th is the domain of souls, which may become the guf in later Kabbalistic thinking, or it's sometimes referred to as the chambers of greatness. And finally, 13 is clearly a prog metal band name, which is the secret of the supreme configuration, which is called the outer holy place. Some have gone under, that is to say, earlier developments of the divine coming to be have actually been replaced in earlier recensions, and Metatron seems to have gone out from the long recension entirely, with new mysterious elements now coming in at the end. So again, the deck has been shuffled a little bit to get us now to these specific 13 Sefirot, but 13 Sefirot there are in this standard edition of the Sefer Ha-Iyyun. There's also an expanded angelology in this text with the introduction of 4 new camps. That language of camps is very Merkava-ish. Camps of angels headed by Michael, Gabriel, Uriel, and Raphael, which now seem to represent primal ontological forces which are shaped to an image or a demut by the divine demiurge. Now all of this sounds like Merkava mysticism meets Platonism, which is probably just what it is. Further elements from Sefer Yetzirah are introduced, especially the emanation of voice, breath, and speech, although where in that process is exactly clear. And while not a specific emanation, Metatron does function just as he did before in the system as a bridge between the divine and celestial worlds, teaching the secrets of creation for those with ears to hear him. Of course, there is a ton of gematria in this text if you're down with gematria stuff, whereby all manner of secrets are revealed from angelic names and permutations of the 4-letter divine name and all kinds of other stuff, all of which culminate in a vision of the whole system as the divine body, concentration upon which merits one both a vision in this world and in the world to come, an element very clearly taken over from the Shiur Kama literature, where one measures the vast divine body and is given merit in this world and in the world to come, just like in this text. Again, more influence coming from the world of Merkava literature. All in all, the Sefer Ha-Iyyun is a wonderful glimpse into the world of the bubbling crucible that became Kabbalah as we know it. But a great many mysteries still remain about it. Why ultimately 13 Sefirot rather than the very strict 10 enumerated in Sefer Yetzirah? I mean, that text is pretty clear. 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. And yet, this text makes really clear there are 13. A couple of possible reasons seem to jump out, or at least be possible. The first is that the later text is actually trying to split the difference between the earlier recensions, which have 13 powers, with the system of the 10 Sefirot originating in the Sefer Bahir and clearly growing in popularity by the latter half of the 13th century. So basically, it's sort of like, why not both? Let's just let it be 13, but call them Sefirot. So why not both? A further possibility is that this system was trying to accommodate itself to the earlier and well-established system of the 13 attributes of divine mercy. That is to say, compassion before and after sin, being merciful, gracious, patient, kind, truthful, forgiving of sins, and cleansing them once you've gotten rid of your sins, which was well known for centuries and well established in rabbinical literature. So 13 was a number already associated with God's character traits. Yet another might be that given the public unveiling of Kabbalistic teachings that came under pretty sustained attack in the mid-13th century, around the same time that this text is undergoing its standard recension, this introduction of the 13 Sefirot may have been an attempt to distance the teachings of the Sefer Ha-Iyyun from the more avant-garde Kabbalah of the Sefer Bahir and these emergent proto-Zoharic teachings emerging in Girona and Castile. So again, the number 13 would have felt traditional, and yet the teachings of the Sefirot would have linked it somehow with the Kabbalah, but maybe again it's trying to hedge its bets as the Kabbalah becomes under sustained attack within even conservative Jewish circles. And this finally leads us to the question of when and who composed these documents and for whom were they composed. Was there even a school around these texts? Sholem held that they were produced around the time that the Sefer Bahir was being edited, as much as it was edited, over in Provence, in France. But based on the examination of various Castilian proto-Kabbalists, especially Rabbi Azrael of Girona, Mark Verman, the leading scholar on this material, has made a really convincing case on literary and even textual evidence that the earliest texts of the Sefer Ha-Iyyun were probably produced in Castile, perhaps in Burgos, prior to 1230. But who wrote the original texts? Again, mysteries abound. The text is clearly informed by the burgeoning esoteric currents of 13th century Spain, but also are incredibly literate on a range of esoteric material prior to it, including Sefer Yetzirah, Merkava mysticism, including the Shiur Koma, magical literature, and it's clearly downstream of oral speculations and teachings which are completely lost to us. Further, this literature wasn't composed in a vacuum, and it shows that the imprint of not just proto-Kabbalistic speculations, but also clearly of Jewish Neoplatonism, Islamic cosmological speculations, and so on. It's really a deeply educated text. So in effect, this text, or really a textual corpus, provides us a unique snapshot into the critical transitional moments by which all of this previous material is being combined into the complicated flux out of which Kabbalah as we know it emerged. Of course, the Sefer Ha-Iyyun is just one of two foundational texts of this specific circle of the Proto-Kabbalah, of which there are dozens of other texts. The other text that I mentioned is the Ma'ayan HaChokhmah, the Fountain of Wisdom, and it's even more difficult and obscure than this book. So much so that Gershom Scholem declared that all the printed editions were basically garbled beyond any recognizable sense. And yet, Moshe Cordovero, the Ramak, thought it a central enough text to study that he included it in his Kabbalistic study guide, which I've done an episode about if you want to check that out. And everybody, of course, knows that I'm completely partial to the teachings of the Ramak, as much as I am partial to any of the teachings of the Kabbalah, but the Ramak's my man. And further, the text was also taught by the Baal Shem Tov to Dov Ber of Mestritz, placing it at the center of the explosion of Kabbalah, popular Kabbalah, of course, as Chassidut, as Chassidism. Thus, I'm going to be coming back to the Fountain of Wisdom for a more in-depth study at some point later on, to be sure. If you're interested in a general overview and readings from this earliest period of Kabbalah, make sure to check out Joseph Don's edition of Early Kabbalistic Text, a collection by that title in the Classics of Western Spirituality series, which is just the best series of these kinds of books. They're both affordable and rigorously wonderful. So any of the Classics of Western Spirituality series you see used, get them. And if you really want to dive into the literature of the Iyyun circle, including about a dozen variations of the text that I've talked about in this episode, make sure to check out Mark Verman's magisterial study and translation of that literature. Now, I've also done a few other episodes on the early Kabbalah, although a bit more superficial than this one, but well worth checking out if you want to know more about that goings-on in the crucible out of which the Kabbalah as we know it came. But, of course, more Kabbalah to come. But until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.